When people imagine ancient Rome, they usually picture order, stone roads, laws carved into marble, and senators debating beneath columns. Civilization, disciplined and permanent. And that picture is not wrong. It's just incomplete. Because if you walked these roads 2,000 years ago, you would have seen something else first. You would have seen the crosses. They stood where travelers could not avoid them, along the highways, at the edges of cities, on hills chosen not for beauty, but for visibility. This was not symbolism. This was infrastructure. Now, if you've grown up hearing about crucifixion, you might assume the stories are exaggerated. Ancient sources tend to be dramatic. Religious traditions tend to soften details. Modern retellings tend to sanitize. Surely, you think it couldn't have been that common. Surely, it couldn't have been that deliberate. Crucifixion was not a rare punishment. It was not reserved for monsters. It was not an act of passion or cruelty gone wrong. It was policy. The Roman Empire ruled millions of people spread across continents. Many of them did not speak Latin. Many of them did not care about Roman law. So Rome spoke in a language that required no translation. A crucified body explained consequences very clearly. It explained who held power. It explained what happened when order was disturbed. And it explained this without a single word. If you were a Roman citizen, crucifixion was something you discussed in theory. If you were a slave, a rebel, or a provincial subject, you learned about it by passing it on your way to work. The Romans themselves were not sentimental about this. They did not pretend crucifixion was just. They did not pretend it was humane. One Roman writer called it the cruelest and disgusting punishment imaginable. So shameful that a citizen should not even mention it in polite conversation. And yet, Rome used it anyway, frequently, publicly, and methodically. Roman government understood something uncomfortable about human nature. Fear lasts longer than words, and a body on a cross lasts longer than a decree. It is what order looked like in the ancient world. Before Rome, the Romans were many inventive, disciplined, ruthless things. But when it came to crucifixion, they were not original. Long before Rome ruled the Mediterranean, other empires were already experimenting with public death. The Assyrians impaled their enemies and carved the results into palace walls, not as decoration, but as warning. The Persians suspended bodies on wooden structures, raising them high above the ground, separating the condemned from the earth itself. These were not executions meant to be hidden. They were announcements. Rome paid attention. Rome always paid attention. As the Republic expanded, it absorbed more than territory. It absorbed methods, ideas about control, ideas about punishment, ideas about what fear could accomplish where persuasion failed. The practice most closely resembling Roman crucifixion came from Carthage, Rome's great rival in the West. Carthaginian generals were crucified for failure. Enemies were displayed after defeat. Rome fought Carthage for over a century, and when Rome finally won, it kept more than the land. This was typical. Rome rarely discarded a useful idea simply because it came from an enemy. Instead, it refined it, organized it, and turned it into procedure. Roman crucifixion was not chaotic violence. It followed rules, it followed customs, it followed expectations. That is what made it effective. Unlike earlier forms of execution, Roman crucifixion was not primarily about killing quickly. Rome already had faster methods. Beheading was efficient. Poison was quiet. Crucifixion served a different purpose. It created time. Time to look, time to think, time to understand exactly why this was happening. A man executed in private disappears. A man executed in public becomes part of the landscape. And Rome was building a landscape of obedience. By the late Republic, crucifixion was becoming the punishment of choice for those who threatened order from below. Slaves, insurgents, criminals whose crimes were political, whether Rome admitted it or not. It is important to understand something here. Rome did not view itself as cruel. Romans believed they were practical. Cruelty, to them, was excess without purpose. Crucifixion, in Roman thinking, had a purpose. One execution could influence thousands. One body could quiet a province. One cross could save a legion from future rebellion. From an administrative perspective, it was efficient. Roman writers were clear about how they felt. Cicero called crucifixion the most vile and degrading punishment imaginable, unfit for Roman citizens, unfit even to be discussed openly among them. And yet the law allowed it, because the law was not written for everyone equally. Roman society was rigidly layered. Status determined not just how you lived, but how you were allowed to die. Crucifixion marked the absolute bottom. It was reserved for those Rome considered expendable, people whose suffering could be used. This is the crucial distinction between Rome and the cultures that came before it. Others used public death to frighten. Rome used it to govern. By the time Rome became an empire, crucifixion was no longer borrowed violence. It was a Roman institution understood by soldiers, understood by governors, understood by anyone who lived under Roman rule. The cross was not yet a symbol, it was a sentence. And it was written across the empire in wood and iron. To understand how Rome ruled, you have to understand how Rome punished. And to understand crucifixion, you have to see how carefully it was designed. Rome discovers crucifixion. Rome liked to think of itself as a civilization governed by reason, law, and tradition, and in many ways it was, but reason alone does not hold an empire together when that empire stretches from rain-soaked forests to desert frontiers, and tradition means little to people who never asked to be ruled in the first place. What Rome needed was not simply justice, but a visible reminder of consequences, something that required no translation and no explanation, something that could be understood instantly by anyone, regardless of language, custom, or loyalty. Crucifixion answered that need. By the late Republic, Rome had already learned that rebellion was not an abstract danger, but a recurring reality, especially in provinces where Roman authority rested on thin layers of cooperation and the permanent presence of soldiers. In those places, punishment was not merely corrective. It was preventative, intended to stop the next revolt before it began by making the cost of resistance unmistakably clear. The law reflected this thinking. Roman legal practice did not pretend that all people stood equal before it, because Roman society itself was not equal. Citizens possessed rights and protections that others did not, and one of those protections was the right to die with dignity. Non-citizens, slaves, and those accused of crimes against the state existed outside that boundary, and it was there at the edges of Roman law that crucifixion found its place. Roman writers were frank about this. Cicero, who understood Roman law as well as anyone, spoke of crucifixion with open disgust, describing it as a punishment so degrading that it should be kept far from the bodies, eyes, and even the thoughts of Roman citizens. His words were not a condemnation of the practice itself, but an acknowledgement of its purpose, because what made crucifixion effective was precisely the fact that it stripped the condemned of every remaining trace of honor. Honor mattered deeply in Roman culture. Reputation, status, and public standing defined a man's worth, and crucifixion was designed to annihilate all three at once. The condemned was not only killed, but displayed, immobilized, exposed to ridicule, pain, and helplessness in a way that made clear he no longer belonged to the human community that Rome claimed to protect. This was not accidental. Roman officials understood that a punishment carried out in private ended with the individual, while a punishment carried out in public extended far beyond the body of the victim. A crucifixion was not simply an execution. It was an event staged deliberately along roads, near city gates, or on elevated ground where it could be seen by as many people as possible for as long as possible. Governors were expected to maintain order, and they were given broad discretion in how they did so. In volatile regions, especially those with histories of unrest, crucifixion became a tool of administration, a way to communicate authority without the constant use of force. A single execution, properly displayed, could do the work of an entire garrison. The choice of victims followed a pattern that Romans found entirely reasonable. Slaves who resisted their masters, criminals whose actions threatened public stability, and rebels who challenged Roman rule were all eligible for crucifixion, not because their individual crimes were necessarily worse than others, but because their suffering could be used as an example. Roman justice was not only about guilt, it was about utility. Nowhere was this clearer than in moments of mass rebellion. When Spartacus led thousands of enslaved people in open revolt, Rome responded with overwhelming force. But the battle itself was only part of the response. After the revolt was crushed, 6,000 captives were crucified along the Appian Way, one of the most important roads in Italy, ensuring that anyone traveling between Rome and the south would pass a continuous line of bodies. This was not an act of uncontrolled rage, nor was it intended primarily to punish the dead. It was a message to the living, a message that could not be ignored, because it was built directly into the infrastructure of everyday life. The roads still functioned. Trade continued. Travelers moved past the crosses, forced to reconcile the efficiency of Roman order with the cost of defying it. Roman officials were not blind to the brutality of this system. They understood the suffering involved, and they accepted it as necessary because they believed that the alternative was disorder, rebellion, and the slow collapse of authority. To a Roman administrator, crucifixion was not cruelty for its own sake, but a calculated response to the realities of ruling an empire without modern communications, police forces, or permanent surveillance. In this sense, crucifixion represented the darker logic of Roman pragmatism. It was a punishment shaped by experience, refined through repetition, and justified by results. Provinces that feared Rome tended to remain quiet, and quiet provinces were easier to govern. Over time, the presence of crucifixion became so familiar that it barely required explanation. Soldiers knew how to carry it out. Local populations knew what it meant. Even the condemned understood, often long before the sentence was formally pronounced, what awaited them if they crossed certain lines. The cross was not yet a symbol, and it carried no abstract meaning. It was a tool as ordinary to Roman authority as the law courts or the legions, and just as essential to the maintenance of imperial control. By the beginning of the empire, crucifixion had become inseparable from Rome's image in the provinces, not because it was constant, but because it was unforgettable. It marked the outer boundary of Roman tolerance, the point beyond which negotiation ended and example began. And once a punishment reaches that level of familiarity, it ceases to shock the society that uses it, even as it continues to terrify those who live under its shadow. That shadow would soon fall on a distant province that Rome considered difficult, troublesome, and permanently unstable, a place where order was fragile and symbols of authority mattered more than ever. And in that province, Rome would carry out what it believed to be one more routine execution, following a policy it had trusted for generations, unaware that this particular death would refuse to remain just another example. How crucifixion actually worked. To understand why crucifixion held such power in the Roman world, it is necessary to move away from symbolism and examine the mechanics, because what made this punishment effective was not mystery or superstition, but design. Crucifixion was constructed to prolong suffering, to make death visible, and to ensure that the process itself communicated Rome's authority long before the victim stopped breathing. The experience often began before the cross ever came into view. Roman executions typically followed a severe scourging, carried out with whips designed to tear skin and muscle rather than simply cause pain. This served multiple purposes. It weakened the body, shortened the time needed for guards to remain on duty, and made the condemned visibly marked even before the final stage began. Ancient sources indicate that some victims died during this phase alone, which was not considered a failure of the sentence, but an acceptable outcome. Those who survived were then forced to carry the horizontal beam of the cross, known as the patibulum, through public streets to the place of execution. This was not done for logistical convenience, but for exposure. The condemned became a moving display, an object lesson woven into the daily life of the city, as people stopped to watch, comment, or turn away. By the time the final site was reached, the punishment had already been seen by hundreds. The upright post, or stipes, was often left permanently in place at execution sites, reinforcing the idea that crucifixion was not an exceptional event, but a standing possibility. Once at the site, the victim was attached to the cross using methods that varied by region and circumstance. Some were tied with ropes, others nailed through the wrists or forearms and through the feet or ankles, depending on what Roman practice and available materials allowed. Contrary to later artistic traditions, nails through the palms would not support the body's weight, and archaeological evidence suggests that the Romans understood this well enough to adjust their methods accordingly. The goal was not immediate death, but suspension, holding the body in a position where breathing became increasingly difficult as strength faded. Once raised, the victim's survival depended on the ability to push upward with the legs and arms to relieve pressure on the chest and draw breath. Over time, muscle exhaustion made this movement harder than impossible. Death followed from a combination of factors: asphyxiation, shock, dehydration, exposure, and in some cases infection or heart failure. There was no single cause, which made the timing unpredictable and prolonged. Roman guards were not instructed to show mercy. Their task was to maintain order, prevent rescue, and ensure that the sentence was completed. They waited, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days, depending on the condition of the victim and the method used. Food and water were not provided, and the environment itself became part of the punishment, as heat, cold, insects, and scavenging animals added to the degradation. In some cases, death was hastened, either because time was short or because officials wished to conclude the spectacle. Legs might be broken to prevent the body from lifting itself to breathe, or a final blow might be delivered to confirm death. These measures were practical, not compassionate, intended to end the process once it had served its purpose. What followed was often just as important as the death itself. Bodies were frequently left on the cross, sometimes for days, as a continued warning. Burial was not guaranteed and was sometimes explicitly denied, extending the punishment beyond death by depriving the victim of funeral rites that Romans believed essential to dignity and remembrance. Archaeological evidence for crucifixion is rare, not because it was uncommon, but because the materials involved decayed and because the bodies of the crucified were often not buried in ways that preserved remains. One notable exception, the heel bone of a man named Yohanan, found near Jerusalem, shows a nail still embedded, providing physical confirmation of ancient descriptions and demonstrating that these accounts were not exaggerated inventions. The variability of crucifixion was part of its psychological impact. There was no single standard form that could be anticipated or endured with certainty. Victims could not know how long they would live, how they would die, or whether their bodies would be taken down afterward. This uncertainty intensified fear, both for those condemned and for those who watched. From the Roman perspective, this unpredictability was a feature, not a flaw. A punishment that followed a fixed script risked becoming familiar, even manageable. Crucifixion remained effective precisely because it resisted routine, adapting to circumstances while maintaining its essential character as a slow, public, and degrading death. It is important to emphasize that Roman audiences did not require detailed explanations of how crucifixion worked. They already knew. The sight of the cross was enough to summon an entire sequence of expectations formed through experience, rumor, and memory. This shared understanding magnified the punishment's power far beyond the individual being executed. Over time, the physical realities of crucifixion became embedded in the culture of Roman rule. Soldiers learned the procedures as part of their duties. Local populations learned the signs that preceded it. Even language absorbed its presence, as references to the cross became shorthand for ultimate disgrace. And yet, despite its familiarity, crucifixion never lost its ability to unsettle, because it targeted something fundamental. It reduced a human being to an object, immobilized, exposed, and slowly failing in full view of others, forcing witnesses to confront not only the power of Rome, but the vulnerability of the body itself. This was the reason crucifixion endured as a punishment for so long. It did not rely on cruelty alone, but on clarity. It showed, without ambiguity, where the limits of Roman tolerance lay, and what happened when those limits were crossed. In this way, the cross became more than a method of execution. It became a language, spoken silently, but understood everywhere Roman authority reached. And nowhere would that language be used more carefully or more frequently than the provinces where resistance simmered just below the surface, where order was fragile and the threat of rebellion never fully disappeared. One such province lay at the eastern edge of the Mediterranean, governed uneasily, watched closely, and remembered far longer than Rome ever intended. Who got crucified and why? Crucifixion was never distributed evenly, and that was the point. Rome did not pretend that punishment should fall the same way on everyone, because Roman society itself was built on distinctions that were meant to be visible, permanent, and understood by all. Who you were determined not only how you lived under Roman rule, but how you were allowed to die if you crossed certain lines. At the bottom of this system were slaves, people legally defined as property and therefore considered expendable in a way free citizens were not. When a slave rebelled, escaped, or threatened authority, crucifixion served a double purpose, punishing the individual while reminding every other slave what resistance ultimately cost. The death was not meant to be private, because the lesson was not meant for the condemned alone. This was why crucifixion appeared so frequently after slave uprisings, and why Rome showed little hesitation in applying it on a large scale. The revolt led by Spartacus was not the first such uprising, but it was the most alarming because it exposed how quickly the lowest class in Roman society could organize and threaten stability. Rome's response was thorough, decisive, and instructional, ending not merely with military victory, but with 6,000 crucifixions along the Appian Way, arranged so that no traveler could avoid the message. The choice of that road was not accidental. The Appian Way was one of Rome's great arteries, carrying trade, officials, and armies between the capital and the south. By lining it with crosses, Rome ensured that the aftermath of rebellion became part of ordinary movement, transforming a military response into a lasting public memory. Even those who had never supported the revolt were forced to absorb its conclusion. Slaves, however, were not the only ones who faced this punishment. Bandits, pirates, and criminals accused of violent theft often ended their lives on crosses as well, although the word criminal in Roman usage frequently concealed something more political. In many provinces, especially those newly conquered or chronically unstable, resistance to Roman authority was labeled as banditry, a convenient way to remove opponents while framing the action as a defensive order. Rebels, whether openly organized or loosely connected, were particularly vulnerable because Rome regarded challenges to its authority as contagious. One successful act of defiance could inspire another, and crucifixion was intended to interrupt that chain of imitation by attaching rebellion to images of prolonged suffering and humiliation. The point was not simply to punish rebellion, but to make it unattractive. Roman citizens, by contrast, occupied a protected category. Even when convicted of serious crimes, they were usually spared crucifixion because the punishment conflicted with Rome's sense of civic dignity. A citizen might be exiled, imprisoned, or executed swiftly, but the slow public degradation of crucifixion was considered inappropriate for someone who belonged fully to the Roman legal community. This exemption reinforced the social hierarchy that crucifixion itself helped maintain. This distinction mattered deeply because it reminded everyone watching that Roman law did not merely punish actions, it reinforced identity. The cross did not just say, "This is what happens if you rebel." It also said, "This is who you are if you do." In the provinces, the line between citizen and non-citizen was often painfully clear. Locals who lived under Roman rule, without enjoying Roman rights, understood that they existed in a different legal universe, one where protections were limited and punishments more severe. Crucifixion became a symbol of that difference, marking the boundary between inclusion and exclusion with brutal clarity. Roman governors relied heavily on this symbolism, especially in regions where unrest was frequent. They were expected to keep order with limited resources, and crucifixion allowed them to magnify their authority beyond their immediate reach. A single execution, if staged effectively, could stabilize an area far more efficiently than a prolonged military presence. There was, however, an element of calculated theater in all of this, and Roman officials understood the importance of choosing victims carefully. Crucifying someone insignificant carried little value, while crucifying someone visible, connected, or known within the community amplified the effect. The death had to resonate, not simply occur. This is where the tension in the Roman system began to build, because the more crucifixion was used to manage dissent, the more closely people watched who ended up on the cross. Each execution invited interpretation, conversation, and memory, even as it was meant to suppress them. Fear worked, but it did not erase meaning. It redirected it. Over time, crucifixion became a grim constant in certain parts of the empire, particularly in territories where Rome's authority rested on fragile arrangements and uneasy compromises. People learned the signs that preceded it, the sudden presence of soldiers, the legal language used to justify it, and the silence that followed once the sentence was carried out. And in one such province, known for its religious intensity, its history of resistance, and its uneasy relationship with Roman power, crucifixion would soon be applied in a way that seemed entirely routine to the officials involved. Another rebel, another disturbance, another public execution, or so it appeared at the time. What Rome could not foresee was that this particular use of the cross would not quiet unrest, nor erase a name, but instead create a story that moved faster and lasted longer than fear ever could. Public spectacle and propaganda. Crucifixion worked only if it was seen, which meant that Roman executions were never hidden, never hurried, and never placed where they might be ignored. Rome understood something basic about power. Punishment that disappears too quickly invites questions, while punishment that lingers answers them in advance. The location of a crucifixion was chosen with care. Roads leading into cities, busy intersections, hills overlooking markets, and spaces just outside city walls were all preferred, because these were places people had to pass through as part of ordinary life. Rome did not interrupt daily routines to display its authority. It inserted authority directly into them. People go to work, saw the condemned. Traders moving goods passed beneath the crosses. Children grew up with these sights at the edge of their vision, absorbing the lesson long before they were old enough to articulate it. In this way, crucifixion became a kind of background noise, constant enough to shape behavior without always demanding attention. Roman officials did not need crowds cheering or reacting dramatically. Silence was more effective. A population that learned to look away at the right moment was a population that understood where power lay. The cross did not ask for emotional response. It imposed comprehension. There was, however, a carefully managed irony at the heart of this system. Crucifixion was intended to strip the condemned of identity, reducing a person to a body and a crime written on a small placard. Yet the very act of public display often fixed that person in memory. Names were forgotten, but images remained, and images had a way of outlasting the fear that created them. Rome attempted to control this by keeping the narrative simple. The condemned were criminals. The punishment was necessary. The order restored itself. No further explanation required. And for the most part, this worked because people living under Roman rule had little incentive to challenge the story publicly. Yet even silence has limits. When executions became too frequent, or when the crime seemed ambiguous, spectators began to notice patterns. They noticed who was punished harshly and who was spared. They noticed which disturbances provoked swift response and which were quietly ignored. In observing the spectacle, they began to read it. This was the tension built into Roman authority. Crucifixion was meant to end conversations, but it also invited interpretation. Every cross suggested not only guilt, but context, and context inevitably led to questions about legitimacy, justice, and power. even if those questions were never spoken aloud. Roman administrators tried to manage this by standardizing the experience. The procedures were familiar. The soldiers followed routines. The signs listing crimes were brief and deliberately vague. The execution looked the same whether the condemned was a violent criminal or a political inconvenience. From Rome's perspective, this uniformity was a strength. It prevented sympathy. It discouraged nuance. It reduced complex situations to simple outcomes. But uniformity also created repetition, and repetition dulled shock while sharpening awareness. Over time, crucifixion became part of the visual language of Roman rule, as recognizable as the eagle standards or the armor of the legions. It communicated dominance efficiently, but also revealed something about the empire itself. An authority that relied on constant public death to maintain order was an authority always managing the possibility of resistance. There is a particular irony in the fact that crucifixion was designed to make individuals disappear into the machinery of punishment, while at the same time providing them with the largest audience they would ever have. Rome wanted obedience, not martyrs, but public death has a way of complicating intentions. Nowhere was this contradiction more pronounced than in provinces where religious belief, identity, and political expectation were already intertwined, places where people were accustomed to interpreting events symbolically and where meaning was never entirely under Roman control. In such places, a cross was never just a cross. And in one such province, the Roman preference for routine, efficiency, and visible authority would collide with a population unusually skilled at turning suffering into story. When that happened, the spectacle Rome relied upon would begin to work in ways it never anticipated. Not immediately, not obviously, but persistently. And once meaning began to travel faster than fear, the cross ceased to belong entirely to Rome. Christianity enters the story. From the Roman point of view, there was nothing unusual about executing people in Judea. The province had a long reputation for unrest, religious intensity, and a stubborn resistance to outside authority, which meant that Roman governors there were expected to act decisively and, when necessary, visibly. Order mattered more than sensitivity, and symbols of control mattered more than local approval. Crucifixion, in this context, was not extraordinary. It was familiar, reliable, and well understood by both soldiers and civilians. Roman officials did not arrive in Judea looking to make examples. The examples were already built into the system. When disturbances occurred, Rome responded the way it always had. Suspected rebels were arrested. Charges were simplified. Sentences were carried out efficiently. The machinery of punishment moved forward without ceremony, because ceremony implied significance, and this was meant to be routine. From the perspective of Roman authority, the execution of a man accused of stirring unrest was not a turning point. It was a conclusion, another potential source of disorder removed, another warning delivered to the population, another body placed where it could be seen. What made this execution different had nothing to do with Roman procedure. The governor followed standard practice. The soldiers did what they had been trained to do. The sentence matched the charge as Rome understood it. Everything unfolded according to expectation. That was the irony. Crucifixion was designed to end stories, not create them. It was meant to erase individuals by reducing them to an object lesson, a body fixed in place, stripped of agency and voice. The cross was supposed to be the last word, but in this case, the story did not end where Rome expected it to. To understand why, it is important to remember that crucifixion was universally recognized in the ancient world as a sign of failure, shame, and defeat. No one admired the crucified. No one aspired to that end. Even Rome's critics did not romanticize it. A crucified man had lost everything that mattered in public life. This is why the earliest followers of Jesus did not immediately adopt the cross as a symbol. To do so would have been unthinkable. A crucified leader was not a hero, he was a contradiction. Worshipping such a figure appeared not only offensive, but absurd. Roman observers noticed this and reacted accordingly. One of the earliest surviving images of a crucified Jesus is not devotional, but mocking, depicting a man worshiping a figure with a donkey's head nailed to a cross, accompanied by a caption ridiculing his belief. To Roman eyes, this was the natural response. The idea deserved laughter, not fear. And yet, something unsettled the normal pattern. Instead of fading, the memory of this execution persisted. Instead of discouraging association, it seemed to attract it. Instead of silencing discussion, it multiplied it, quietly at first, then with increasing confidence. Rome had seen this before in small ways. Martyrs were inconvenient. They complicated narratives. They turned punishment into testimony. But this was different in scale and endurance, because the story being told did not deny the shame of crucifixion. It embraced it. This was unprecedented. Rome relied on the assumption that no one would willingly associate themselves with the cross. Fear depended on that assumption. Once it began to fail, the entire logic of the punishment weakened. Crucifixion had always worked because it aligned power with meaning. Rome controlled both the act and its interpretation. Now, interpretation was slipping beyond Roman reach. To Roman officials, this development was puzzling, then irritating, then threatening. They had not misapplied the punishment. They had applied it correctly. The problem was not the execution, but what followed it. The cross, intended as a warning, was being retold as a message. The shame, intended to repel, was being reframed as purpose. The death, intended to end influence, was being presented as the beginning of it. This was not something Rome could easily counter, because it was not happening in courts or on battlefields. It was happening in conversation, memory, and belief, spaces where Roman authority was always weakest. For the first time, the empire encountered a situation where its most effective instrument of control was being reused in a way it had never intended and could not fully prevent. The execution Rome considered routine had escaped its original function. And once that happened, the cross stopped being only a Roman tool. It began to acquire a life of its own. From horror to symbol. For a long time, Rome treated the movement that followed this execution as an irritation rather than a threat. It was small, scattered, and socially insignificant, composed largely of people who already existed at the margins of imperial life. Rome had seen many such groups come and go, and most disappeared without requiring serious attention. What Rome underestimated was not the size of the movement, but its relationship to the cross. Early Christians did not deny the manner of the execution. They did not soften it, reinterpret it as an accident, or pretend it had been misunderstood. Instead, they insisted on repeating it, describing it openly, and placing it at the center of their story, even though doing so invited ridicule and suspicion from nearly everyone around them. This was deeply unsettling from a Roman point of view. Crucifixion was supposed to be final. It was meant to end authority, erase influence, and discourage imitation. Yet here were people doing precisely the opposite, organizing their identity around the very punishment designed to prevent such cohesion. At first, the cross itself remained absent from Christian imagery. The shame attached to it was too immediate, too culturally ingrained. Early believers preferred indirect symbols, simple signs that avoided confrontation with Roman sensibilities. The message existed, but it was careful. Over time, however, something changed. As the original witnesses died and new generations took their place, the memory of the execution hardened into narrative, and narrative began to outweigh fear. The cross, once avoided, became unavoidable. Roman authorities noticed this shift with growing concern. What had been mockery turned into suspicion, and suspicion into periodic persecution. Yet each attempt to suppress the movement relied on familiar tools: arrest, trial, execution, and in some cases, crucifixion itself. The irony was impossible to escape. Rome was using the same language again, hoping for the same result, and receiving a different outcome. The problem was no longer the punishment. It was the audience. Public executions, once effective in isolating and silencing individuals, now created figures whose deaths were remembered, retold, and honored within tightly knit communities. The logic of deterrence depended on isolation. Memory defeated it. Roman critics continued to argue that the idea was absurd. Philosophers dismissed it as irrational. Satirists mocked it openly. A crucified savior remained, by Roman standards, a contradiction that should have collapsed under its own weight. And yet it did not. Instead, the cross began to shift its meaning, slowly and unevenly, not through official decree, but through repetition. The more often it appeared in stories, in gatherings, and in quiet acts of devotion, the less exclusively Roman it became. The symbol was being taken from its original context and placed somewhere Rome could not regulate. By the 3rd century, the change was unmistakable. The cross, once a mark of disgrace, was beginning to signify endurance, loyalty, and identity. What Rome had intended as a warning was now functioning as a bond. This was the point at which Roman power faced an unfamiliar challenge. Military threats could be met with force. Political threats could be negotiated or eliminated. But a reinterpretation of meaning was harder to confront because it did not announce itself clearly and did not rely on centralized leadership. The empire responded unevenly, alternating between tolerance and repression, uncertain whether it was dealing with a dangerous movement or a temporary anomaly. The old assumptions still held. Crucifixion was effective, public punishment worked, fear maintained order, but evidence was accumulating that those assumptions no longer applied universally. Eventually, even the law began to change. By the early 4th century, crucifixion disappeared from Roman legal practice. The reasons were practical as much as symbolic. The punishment no longer achieved its original purpose, and its continued use risked strengthening the very ideas it was meant to suppress. When crucifixion was finally abandoned, Rome did not frame the decision as an admission of failure. Instead, the change was absorbed quietly into legal reform, as though the practice had simply outlived its usefulness. But history is not always persuaded by official explanations. The cross survived Rome's abandonment of it. It outlasted the empire's authority over meaning and emerged transformed, no longer a tool of control, but a symbol that pointed beyond it. What Rome had created to enforce silence had become one of the most powerful images ever produced by the ancient world. And it did so not by denying its origin, but by remembering it. From warning sign to world symbol. Rome believed it understood power better than anyone else, and for a very long time, it was right. The empire built roads that outlasted generations, laws that shaped entire legal traditions, and armies that redrew the map of the known world. It also perfected a punishment meant to make resistance unthinkable. Crucifixion was designed to erase, to humiliate, to warn, to ensure that no one would ever want to remember the condemned, except as an example of failure. In that sense, it worked exactly as intended, until it didn't. When Rome finally abandoned crucifixion, it did so quietly, without ceremony or apology, as though the practice had simply become obsolete. The empire moved on, convinced that history would follow its lead, just as it always had. History, however, kept the cross. The instrument Rome used to enforce silence became a symbol that spoke everywhere its legions once marched. The punishment meant for the lowest and most disposable members of society became associated with endurance, identity, and meaning. The death intended to end a story became the reason it survived. There's a certain irony in this that no Roman administrator would have appreciated. Rome did not lose control of the cross through rebellion or conquest, but through repetition. By using it so efficiently, so visibly, and so confidently, the empire ensured that it would never be forgotten. Empires prefer their symbols to serve them. Rome learned, too late, that symbols sometimes escape. The roads still exist in places. The laws echo in modern courts. The empire itself is long gone, but the cross remains, not as Rome intended it, and not as Rome could ever have predicted.